Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Hello, Warbirders. One of the reasons to love the aviation of the 1930s and 1940s was the willingness of the participants to try just about anything. And sometimes the experiments worked, and sometimes they didn't. One of these experiments was a fighter plane on floats. There was a flurry of activity in this area for a while, and then they were gone forever. So much so that even the idea of a modern jet fighter being on floats is laughable. One of the first float plane fighters was the Italian RO-44. It was an offshoot of the RO-43, which was a recon float plane, and it first flew in 1936. It was a single-seat biplane with a radial engine and a big central float and two wing floats, and was armed with two forward-firing 12.7mm machine guns. Although it had the performance to tangle with the other biplanes of the interwar years, it was not going to be able to survive against the new land-based monoplanes. Also, its handling on the water was reputed to be so god-awful that although over 50 were initially ordered, the Regia Aeronautica said, "Thanks, no thanks," at 35, and these would only be used as trainers. One of the other nations that seriously flirted with float fighters was Britain. In spring 1940, when Germany invaded Norway, the RAF pondered the use of float fighters to operate in areas where there were no airfields yet. So a Spitfire Mark I was yanked out of the production line and sent to become an experimental water bird. Now, remember, this is not as outrageous as it seems, as the Spitfire had its origins in Supermarine's award-winning racing float planes, and so there was float planes somewhere in the Spitfire's DNA. The Spitfire in question, serial number R6772, was mounted on two wing floats that had been constructed for another experiment of putting a Blackburn Rock, which was a British carrier-based fighter, on floats. That experiment had failed when the resulting aircraft had been too slow, so they slapped the leftover floats on the Spit. However, the Battle of Norway ended and the perceived need for a floating Spitfire evaporated. On the other hand, there was a real need for as many wheeled Spits as possible. So before R6772 was even able to fly as a float fighter, she was switched back to wheels to fight in the Battle of Britain. Later that year, another nation would begin a serious love affair with float fighters. And to carry the analogy a little further, this affair would bloom beyond dating into a serious long-term relationship. Of course, that nation was Japan. It made sense, really. Japan was aggressively expanding out across the Pacific, and although it had extensive aircraft carrier capabilities, at least at the start of the war, it also had an entire float and seaplane infrastructure to support air activities at islands that were too small to have a land airfield, or perhaps locations where airstrips had not yet been built. It takes time and serious engineering effort to carve an airstrip out of jungle islands, but if you have a beach and a sheltered bay or lagoon, you can have an almost instant seaplane base. So in 1940, the Imperial Japanese Navy, the IJN, published a requirement for a float plane fighter, and the Kawanishi Aircraft Company stepped up. Unlike all the other fighters we're going to talk about, theirs would be designed from the start as a float fighter. The Kawanishi N-1K was powered by the very powerful Nakajima Homare 21, which was a two-row, 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine that churned out almost 2,000 horsepower. The fuselage sat on a long, sleek single float that extended back from just forward of the tail to several feet ahead of the propeller spinner, and there were two stabilizing floats on the wings. The IJN's requirements for their float fighter were pretty demanding, and so the N-1K, which the Allies dubbed the Rex, was a long time in development. Meanwhile, the IJN wanted a float fighter right away, so they also did what every other country involved in this endeavor did. They took an existing land fighter and slapped some floats on it. Which fighter would they adapt? The A6M2 Model 11 Zero fighter. The Nakajima Aircraft Company took the Model 11, removed all the landing gear mechanism and the middle drop tank, and installed a central float that they derived from their own E-8N-1 float biplane known to the Allies as a Dave. The central float was attached by a forward-sloping pylon and a V-strut in the rear. The central float also served as a fuel tank with the plumbing going through the pylon. There were also 2 wing floats, and the tail was modified for greater stability. The resulting float fighter was known as the A6M2N, and the Allies called it the Roof. It first flew on the 7th of December 1941. That date seems familiar. The A6M2N entered service in 1942 and fought in battles in the Aleutians and Solomon Islands operations. Even with the drag of the floats and the struts, the Roof had pretty good performance. They brought down at least 2 B-17s and even shot down a P-38 Lightning. Nakajima built 327 of them. When U.S. forces ran into the Roof, there was a thought that maybe they should get them some of that. So, finally we get to the aircraft that inspired this whole episode. A Grumman Wildcat, serial number 4038, was pulled out of the line and sent to the Edo Aircraft Corporation for conversion. When I first read that, to me it sounded like a Japanese company, but no, it was named after its founder, Earl Dodge Osborne, and they had a specialty in building pontoons for float planes. Like the Spitfire conversion, they mounted the Wildcat on twin floats. To improve the stability of the fighter that was now upset by the floats, they added funky auxiliary fins to the ends of the horizontal stabilizers, and later tacked on a ventral fin. The resulting float fighter was officially called the F4F-3S, but in my opinion had the best name of them all with WildcatFish. Unfortunately, the Wildcat was already outclassed by the Zero, and the floats and extra fins and struts and stuff made its performance even worse. Also, U.S. Navy Seabees had proven that they could throw up airfields on remote islands in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. Only one WildcatFish ever existed, and I don't know what ever happened to it. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the on-again, off-again flirtation with float fighters was on again. On the 8th of December 1941, the decision was made to have another go at the idea, and so Folland Aircraft was asked to turn a Spitfire Mark 5B into a Waterbird. Instead of borrowing floats from another aircraft like before, this time the floats were designed by Arthur Shervill, who was none other than the man who had designed the floats for Supermarine's Schneider Trophy entries. Shervill went with twin 25-foot long wing floats. The aircraft had a 1,100 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin 45 engine, and the propeller got an extra blade at 4 instead of 3. The water spit was armed with 2mm cannon and 4 303-inch machine guns. It first flew on the 12th of October 1942, and I guess the trials went pretty well as it was decided to convert 2 more machines. The plan was to send the machines to be based on small Greek islands in the Aegean Sea, where they could pop up and intercept German transports flying over the Mediterranean. For this, the machines were shipped to Egypt. However, the islands that they had in mind were captured by the Germans, and the 3 water spits ended up languishing in Egypt, and eventually being struck off charge without ever operating or firing their guns in anger. The fickle British flirtation with float fighters was then off again. Over in Japan, finally, in 1943, the Rex, remember, the purpose-built float fighter, was ready. It was an impressive machine, with its powerful 2,000-horse engine and a fancy-schmancy flap system that would automatically engage to extend the flaps during steep turns. Known as combat flaps, these generated more lift and allowed tighter turns. It was armed with a good punch with 4 20mm autocannon in the wings. However, Japan's needs had changed by this time. Japan had wanted float fighters for use in rapid expansion on islands that they were quickly capturing and hadn't had time to build an airfield. Well, by 1943, the days of expansion were over and the empire was on the defensive. Whatever islands they wanted to hold usually had an airstrip, and float fighters, including both the Rex and the Roof, were always going to be at a disadvantage over their wheeled opponents, especially as the new American fighters such as the Hellcats and Corsairs arrived in the theater. Japan withdrew its float fighters from the front lines and started using them more for support duties. Also, the Rex bucked the usual trend and entered a program to convert it from float fighter to land fighter, where it would become the impressive N1KJ Shiden, which means Violet Lightning, which is a great name for a plane, a band, or a cocktail. The Allies just called it the George. You know those couples that are just wrong for each other, but they just keep going back, breakup after breakup? That was like the Brits with float fighters. On the 18th of June 1944, a Spitfire Mark IX took to the air. Again, it had been fallen aircraft to do the conversion, and they had done a good job. The thrust of the 1,720 Rolls-Royce Merlin made it the fastest float plane of the Second World War, with a top speed of 377 miles per hour. To fight, it had two 20mm cannon and four 303-inch machine guns. But of course, it was never to fight, and a little over a year later, it was struck off charge on the 22nd of November 1945. After their torrid and messy love affair, the Brits had finally broken up with the idea of float fighters for good. Or had they? Yes, I'm looking at you, Saunders Row SRA-1. If you enjoy learning about these weird and wonderful warbirds, then hit like or subscribe, and even help out with a super thanks. You can also listen to the hours of content in the extensive back catalog of audio-only episodes. Until next time.